All right. Thanks for coming. My name is Jason. This is Andrew Grexa. And what's your last name?
Bahl.
Okay. Oh, gosh. I'm blanking. I'm so sorry.
Right. Tori Wong.
Tori Wong. I'm so sorry. Oh, gosh. Anyway, we're co-organizers. Want to do special thanks to Gusto for sponsoring, and Gatsby is a sponsor. Gatsby brought the food. Gusto got the location, all sorts of other goodies like security for us. Next meetup is going to be here again on January 28th.
Yes.
28th. So here again, we are looking for speakers. So you can go to the meetup page if you're interested in talking about GraphQL. It could be any level, beginner, intermediate, advanced, whatever. You know, if you're building a project with it and want to show it off, talk about it. So yeah, we got lightning talks or longer talks. So if you're interested in speaking, you could come speak to us or go to the meetup page, and we got a link where you can fill out a speaker application.
I can help you brainstorm ideas too if you don't know what you want to talk about, but you know you want to talk about.
Yeah. Any other? That's it for announcements? Sweet. Cool, yeah. So I'm talking tonight about WordPress, GraphQL, and Gatsby. Do we have any WordPress users here? Couple. Sweet. Cool. Any Gatsby users here? Yeah, sweet. GraphQL users? Who's brand new to GraphQL looking to learn? Who's been using GraphQL since it was born? No, just me. All right, sweet. Just getting a gauge of what I should cover. All right. So first off, who am I? I'm a software engineer at Gatsby. Denver native, been here my whole life. Been doing WordPress development for over a decade now. Huge fan of WordPress, open source in general. And I maintain a plugin called WPGraphQL, which brings GraphQL to WordPress. Just pictures of my family. All right, so some stuff we're going to go over today. First off, like why WordPress and GraphQL? Why does this even make sense in the first place? We'll look briefly at like installing and using the GraphQL plugin for WordPress. We're going to look at what that means for WordPress as an application data graph, how GraphQL helps fetch data efficiently, and then we're going to look at WP GraphQL and Gatsby together, and then what's next. So first off, why WordPress and why WordPress and GraphQL? So I worked at a newspaper. May have heard of it. It's called the Denver Post. We had what 100 and something newspaper, 104-ish, give or take, newspapers across the U.S. I think, U.S. And we did a lot of content syndication. So published an article about the Broncos losing again on Denver Post. Boulder, of course, wants it, but doesn't have somebody writing the story. So you click publish on Denver. We want it published on Boulder Daily Camera. We also need it sent to print systems so we could print the newspaper. So it all starts in WordPress, ends up online, ends up on a mobile app, ends up on other websites, ends up in print, right? So we're sending data all over the place. We needed, like I said, these micro apps like our native iOS and mobile need to read data from WordPress, as well as, yeah, all these other things. So this is what it kind of looks like. We have WordPress on the back end. This is like the dashboard. WordPress published the front end. You can go browse on your desktop. And, oh gosh, my resolution is not matching this. There we go. Little zoom. Yeah. And then, of course, we had to populate the print. So WordPress was the content management system, and it was outputting to different places, but you could also edit in different ways. WordPress has its traditional dashboard, but it also has applications like this is called Calypso in the WordPress ecosystem. It allows you, it's a headless React app that allows you to interact with WordPress. And then there's actual native apps as well that you can interact with WordPress. We were heavily using the WordPress REST API for a while to do this stuff. But as our network grew, when I started there, we had one site getting ready to launch on WordPress. By the time I left just a few months ago, we had a little, 50 something. I think we were 54 sites by the time I left. So as our network grew, we had a lot of frustrations with REST that we didn't necessarily realize early on. Some frustrations we had with REST were implicit requests are difficult for long-term code maintenance. What I mean by that is that with REST, you hit an endpoint like /posts or /articles, and you get back who knows what, right? You're making a very implicit request saying, I want post, and the server gets to decide the shape of the data that you're getting back. It's really easy to get going with because you get a bunch of data, and it was very easy to ask for it. But long term, when bugs start happening in your applications, it's very difficult to hop into a piece of code and try and track down a bug if you don't know exactly what the intent of the person who wrote the code was trying to accomplish. We also had this issue with constant over and under fetching. So what that means with content syndication, we were syndicating a newspaper article, but what that means is we're syndicating the article itself, the images that go along with it, the author, the categories and tags, and the metadata kind of associated with each article. So you're not just syndicating an article, you're syndicating the author and the image. And so you're constantly talking to these different systems for all these resources. And most of the time you only need slices of those resources, like the author name, for example. You might not need its whole bio and whatever. But with REST, you're getting all that data that you might not need. And then you have to do round trips to get the other data because it's just going to give you like an ID as a reference to something else. So you're constantly over and under fetching at the same time. So all these requests to read and write data became quite a headache. So I pitched to the team, we have this infrastructure, we're using REST API. Why don't we take GraphQL and wrap our REST API over it, or wrap GraphQL over our REST API so that we can take advantage of some benefits of GraphQL, like individual requests that can talk and get many resources in one request. So I prototyped using Apollo server. It's a JavaScript node server that allows you to spin up GraphQL servers fairly quickly, I would say. So I prototyped that in Node and then talked to WordPress behind the scenes with REST still. So then our team could use GraphQL to use the benefits of GraphQL to make individual requests that are very explicit. So then our team could see, oh, when we make this request, we're asking for these exact fields. So 6 months from now, I'm going to know what that person was doing, right? So we could start taking advantage of GraphQL, but it turns out if you have a slow REST API, you have a slow GraphQL API. And that was our problem. So I'm going to show you this. This is the actual Denver Post REST API. Thousands of dollars a month in hosting. Oops. So I'm going to open up Network Tools. You guys can watch this with me. So this is real life. This isn't not gaming anything. Take a nap with. I mean, we are on Gusto Wi-Fi. I don't know. I'm just kidding. We'll see. Yeah, we're asking for 100 posts from the production Denver Post website, which pays thousands of dollars a month for hosting, again. 14.81 seconds, 419 kilobytes of data. So GraphQL sounded good for some of the cool like tooling benefits, but slow REST API behind the scenes means slow GraphQL API, and some of the issues we were having were performance related. So didn't quite make sense to go this route where you have another server that has to boot up and then talk to something slow behind it. So we had these frustrations, but now we also had performance frustrations, and yeah. So instead of taking GraphQL Server and having it talk to the WordPress REST API, I suggest why don't we just bring GraphQL straight to the WordPress level and have GraphQL talk directly to WordPress. So that's kind of where WPGraphQL was born, which is a plugin I created at the newspaper and open sourced it and continue to maintain it today. So WordPress looks something like this. We have a persistence layer, which is typically MySQL in WordPress. WordPress ships with an authorization layer and business logic layer. That's pretty much all WordPress. The PHP side of it is that. And then it ships with a RESTful API and a XML RPC API. And so WPGraphQL just kind of fills in this spot here. So it's kind of on top of the authorization and business logic layer, still talks to the persistence layer, respects, you know, existing rules you've set in business logic, things like that. So WPGraphQL is a free open source WordPress plugin that provides extendable GraphQL schema and API for any WordPress site. So for those who haven't used WordPress ever or in a while or whatnot, this is just kind of quick rundown of what WordPress kind of looks like in recent days. So we have content types, what are called post types in WordPress. So you can have posts or pages by default, but you can register any type of content you can think of. It could be houses or cars or like any kind of content you want to manage. You can do things like search for your content in the dashboard, filter it, sort it, things like that. You can edit your content. This is the classic editor. I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, so you can edit things like the title and the content, and then custom fields. And you can categorize with categories or tags, or you can create custom taxonomies to group your content in different ways. You can create these, you can manage your tags and categories or custom terms like make, model of a car, for example, or whatever you might need. It's got a robust media library where you can do things like crop and edit metadata, captions, and alt tags, and things like that. It's got user management, so you can assign roles and capabilities to users, grant them certain access to certain types of data, restrict them from other things. It's got a commenting system built in for, you know, blog style comments, but you can use it for whatever you want to have like back and forth conversations. It's got a theme API, so you can easily change the skin of your WordPress site. Has a rich plugin ecosystem, so you can just go install with the click of a button and get your site a lot of new functionality. So that's kind of the rundown of WordPress. So when you add WP GraphQL to WordPress, it's on GitHub. WordPress has a .org repository. It's not on there. If you're really interested in hearing why, I can talk to you about that later. But so you go to GitHub, of course, you start the repo, and then you tweet about how awesome GraphQL and WordPress is. And then you download the plugin, and then you install and activate it. So it looks something like this. You get the plugin in your WordPress dashboard. In this case, I got two plugins. One is WP GraphQL. The other is what's called GraphQL, which is like an IDE tool for interacting with GraphQL. Install both of these. You get this GraphQL button in your admin. And then you get this GraphQL IDE where you can start interacting with GraphQL in your WordPress dashboard. So yeah, it completes that picture. So we have WordPress, we got posts, we got users, comments, pages, terms, media, and turns it into a graph. All right. So for those that aren't that familiar with GraphQL, this is kind of what a hello world of GraphQL queries looks like. This would, it basically looks like JSON keys without the values. So you make a request and you state what you want. So in this case, I'd be querying viewer, which would be maybe the logged in viewer, and then the name of that viewer. And in response, you get actual JSON with the keys and values, and it matches the shape that you requested. Visually, WordPress looks like this as an application data graph. At the heart of WordPress, we have posts, or it could be pages or houses or whatever data type you're working with. And those posts, or what I'll call nodes of data, have properties like maybe a title, like Hello World. And those nodes have connections to other nodes, like a post could be connected to a category or an image, or yeah, multiple categories in this case. And those nodes can have properties like name, and those nodes can have connections to other nodes, like another post or another image. And it goes on, right? So GraphQL lets us pick trees out of the application data graph. So we can make a request, something like this, which says, hey, GraphQL, I want to make a query, and I want a specific post. I'm going to pass an ID of a post I want. And in response, I just want the title, the link, and the categories that are connected to it. And on those categories, I just want their name. And in response, I'll get a payload like this, which matches the request. I get a post, I get the title of that post, I get the link to it, I get a list of categories, the category nodes, and just their name. So visually, it looks something like this. I entered the graph at the post, and I asked for the categories and the names, and it stopped there. So there's this entire graph of data I could access, but I stopped there. So that's all I want. Please give me just that. Oops. Yeah, so I'm going to walk through. This is a WPGraphQL specific, but a lot of things I'm going to talk about will apply to any GraphQL server, give or take. So this is kind of like one of those hello world queries. So this is graphical, the IDE. So this is like an interactive tool where we can click to execute GraphQL requests. So this is actually talking to a live WordPress site. So I can query things like the general settings, and I can ask for, let's say, the title and the description and an unset language in this case. I can ask for a list of posts and their nodes, and in response, I'll get those nodes. One thing I'll briefly talk about, can everybody see this? Is this big enough to read? Okay, cool. So one thing in GraphQL that you may or may not have already come across is this concept of edges and nodes. So GraphQL itself doesn't make any prescription over the shape of your GraphQL API. You could have it look like whatever you want it to. This concept of edges and nodes comes from what's called the relay specification for GraphQL servers. So it's an opinion on what GraphQL servers should look like to overcome many issues that you might run into with GraphQL. So when we looked at it visually, I'll just take a step back real quick. When we looked at a graph visually, we have this concept of nodes, right? A post is a node and a category is a node. Well, between these two nodes, there's relational data, right? Think of a social network where I'm a user and you're a user. There's context of our relationship, like the day we became friends. It's not a property of me as a user, and it's not a property of you as a user. It's a property of that edge space between us, the relationship between us. So when consuming an API, it's often that you're going to cache the data that you consume, and you don't want to cache that data on this node or that node. You want to cache it somewhere in between. So that's why you'll see in a lot of GraphQL APIs this concept of edges and nodes. It allows for that relational data to exist somewhere in the API, and then you can cache that somewhere other than the node itself. So that's when you see that, that's kind of where that comes from. One, we'll look at it in a minute, but one example of this like additional data would be for pagination of APIs. Like if you're querying for a list of posts, you might want to know, are there more posts and how many posts are there? And can I ask for more, or did I reach the end and should I stop? So yeah, we can query for things like posts. One thing I'll point out real quick too, let me move this Zoom thing. Yeah, so GraphQL has a strongly typed schema. So tools like this can actually query the schema itself and build pretty cool interactive tools like this documentation explorer. So I can actually click into my schema and look at what all is available to me. I can also search it. Like if I know I'm dealing with a schema that has posts, I can start searching the word post and to see all the ways I can interact with posts or pages, for example. I could say page. And this is going to document for me like what exists in this API with pages and how can I interact with it. So I can click into this and we'll see it has like descriptions and other fields that belong to this thing, right? I can also, on this side, I'm going to close that. On this side, I can start typing. If I know something like posts, I'm pretty sure posts have an author. I don't know what it's called, I can start typing, and tools like this know what is available on each post, so it can help, type hint for me. So I can say author, and then it's going to tell me, like, I can't just ask for an author because authors have properties themselves. You have to ask for a property. So it's telling me you're doing something wrong, pal, right? Like right here. Like I can try to execute that. And it was smart enough to say, hey, you got to ask for something. Here's the first field I could find. So it's going to try and help me out. Say, hey, if you want the author, you also need to ask for fields of the author, right? So tooling like this is amazing for GraphQL. We can ask, like my example, we can ask for an individual post. We can pass an ID to it, and in response, we'll get just an individual post. If you are familiar with WordPress, this ID might look weird to you. WordPress uses integer IDs like this, typically. So the difference here, and this also comes from the relay spec for GraphQL. This is what's called the hashed ID. So it takes the type of content it is and then hashes it with the actual database ID. And this again comes from a caching issue. In a lot of GraphQL client caches, they will cache all nodes of any type in one normalized cache. And in WordPress, you have post could have ID 1, comment could have ID 1, tags could have ID 1, users could have ID 1. So in a normalized cache where everything's in one cache bucket, basically, caching with that ID would be problematic because all of a sudden ID 1 could be a user or it could be a post. So hashing like this makes sure it's unique across all types. That will always be a post. So you might see that in some GraphQL servers that you interact with. You can query other types of content like pages, much like we did with posts. You can query categories. And for something like categories that are hierarchical in nature, they have children to them, you can actually specify the children that you want and specify what level you want to go. This is a bad example because I don't actually have any children in this data set, but you can probably imagine what the response would look like if I did have children. You can query users, right? Most applications need access to some sort of user data, so we can query users. With proper capabilities, we can query plugins and themes. Typically, these are going to be restricted to people who have proper access to these objects. So we can build these headless applications now, right, in React or Swift and iOS or whatever we want, and interact with WordPress data. And then we can, of course, query settings. Oh, I have a mistake in this one, and it's telling me right here, like, hey, this isn't actually a field. Why did you do that, pal? So we can query settings, like whatever settings you might have in your WordPress site that might be beneficial to your application. So I want to go over some features of the GraphQL query language. Some of these are somewhat unique to specifically WPGraphQL, but most of them are going to apply to almost any GraphQL server you'll come across. So connections are a concept also from the relay spec of getting lists of data. So that's where the edges and node come from. They're part of connections. So they're lists of data. And with connections, so GraphQL allows us to pass arguments. Also, you'll see here, I asked for posts, but now I'm specifying, I just want the first 5 posts, right? So I can execute a query like that and say, I just want 5 posts. And we can see we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we can pass arguments. I can also say maybe just 1, right? Like I just want the first post, right? And we get just 1 post. But typically in a RESTful API or many APIs, you can only pass arguments at one level of the API request. Well, with GraphQL, we can pass it at any level that the field supports arguments. So in this case, I'm asking for a post, and I specify 1 post, but I can also specify arguments on other fields within that. So this is categories of each post, but instead of a hierarchical list, I'm asking, I want this to output in a flat list instead of a hierarchical list, right? So I can specify deeply in my API request arguments. I can also do things like, let's say, like I could do content, and I can specify maybe the format, whether I want it to be like raw, unrendered HTML, just like what's raw in the database, or rendered, right? So all throughout, I can pass arguments, and GraphQL can take that and do something special with it. I can ask for multiple root resources. So in this case, I'm asking for posts, but at the same level, I'm asking for users. So typically, this would be, in most APIs, this would be multiple requests. I'd have to say, hey, I want users, wait. Hey, I want posts, wait, and then do something with the data. Here, if I want, I can make an individual request that says, I need, for this UI that I'm building, I need posts and users. So in one HTTP request, I can ask for multiple resources and get them back. I can, again, pass different arguments at different levels, like I want 5 posts, but 2 users, and I want that user's most recent post, right? So I can do these like deeply nested relational things with one API request. And we'll see here, we got the post, and we got the users, and then on the users, we got the users' posts, right? And as far as, like if, I'll get into this a little bit more, but as far as efficiently responding, typically, like in this case, we ask for posts twice, and we ask for users twice, because an author is a user too. So typically, during execution, like the author of this post has already been queried, right? So we don't need to re-execute to figure that out. It's hot in the like session cache. So we can respond right away, where if you were asking for posts and the user and then users in the post, it'd have to figure that out separately, right? So yeah, so you can save a lot on execution time. There's a really, I think this is probably one of my favorite features of GraphQL. Really makes it shine, especially if you're building things like React or Vue applications, the whole like component-based architecture of applications fragments. So what this allows us to do, we saw my previous examples, I was having fields in here like ID and title. And when I would execute that, oh, what did I screw up? Yeah, I got to comment that out. Oh gosh. So I was typing my fields in here and I was getting them. Well, in a lot of component-based architectures, you might divide your application into multiple components. Like you might have a list component and an individual post component, right? And the list would map over and then render the post component. So the post component would actually be responsible for the fields that it renders, much like it's responsible for the HTML that renders it. And in a lot of cases, the CSS that styles it. So what fragments allow you to do is couple the data that you need to render in that component with the component itself. So you can move this fragment into a different file and say, I have a post component that is responsible for rendering these fields. And then turns out the post also renders the author. I'm going to have a separate author component that's responsible for rendering that. So I can have this fragment in my author component, this fragment in my post component, and this query in my list component. And then when your manager comes up and says, hey, we no longer want to show the date on any post, you don't have to go like around your application like, well, we query for posts over here, we transform it here, we send it over here, and then we render it over here. You just say, oh, I can go to the post component where the post asks for the date and outputs the markup to render the date. And when your manager says, hey, we don't need to do that anymore, you say, oh, cool. We're not going to fetch the date anymore. Oh, I should probably show you with the date. So it had the date. So I can go into the post component. I can go delete the markup that rendered it, like your span tag or whatever it might be. I can delete any associated styles potentially. And then I can delete the field here. And next time my application runs, we're not getting the date. So it's cleaning up technical debt as you go, right? So super cool feature. I think one of my favorite features of GraphQL. And aliases. So this is another one, talking about like reusable components. With GraphQL, you can actually tell it what you want the field to be returned as in response. So we're querying for posts and nodes and ID, title, and excerpt. But let's say I created a GraphQL or a React or Vue component that I wanted to use across different types of data. So let's say I created a card list component that wants a list of cards, and on each card it wants a key, a card title, and a card description. Now it doesn't matter if it's coming from WordPress or anything else. I just have this general reusable component. And when I execute this, I'm getting posts, right, from WordPress, but it's coming back called card list and cards with key, card title, and card description. So as far as your component is concerned, it's got the data in the shape that it needs, and it can render it. So here, I can ask for posts and categories, and with aliases, I can get them in the same shape, right? So I can execute this, and we're going to get posts. We can see it's of type post here. This is a hidden field that any GraphQL server will support. Type name. On any object type, you can ask for type name. So we can see that I'm getting cards, a list of cards with type name, key, title, description. If I collapse this, these are type categories, so they're different type of data, but it's the same shape. Type name, key, title, description, link, right? So an action that looks something like this. I can use this query of list 1 and list 2, right? Posts, and then I can map over my list and pass it to this reusable card component that I created. And here we can see it rendering. We have a list of posts and a list of terms, but it's using the same React component, right? Variables. So any GraphQL server is going to support variables if you have arguments. So in this case, previously I was typing post first, and then I was typing 1 or 2 here. Well, in this case, I changed it to a variable. So what that looks like in GraphQL, we have this $, and then you can name it anything you want. I can type whatever I want without spaces or special characters. And that would be a valid name. The Zoom thing is in my way. So that would be a valid name. I don't know why you do that. But it knows that that's the variable, right? So it's going to help me out. So it's going to say, whatever variable I input here is going to be the value used here. So if I put 1, I'm going to get 1 post. If I put 2, or 12, if I put 2, I'm going to get 2 posts, right? It's probably going to make sense to name it something that actually means something. So what this allows to do, the benefits of variables, it allows your query string to remain unchanged, right? There's no dynamic pieces to it, like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So what that allows you to do is do things like tracking, performance tracking, logging, things like that, where if this value was actually like concatenated differently every time you used it, it'd be a mess to like go through your logs and figure out, when is this thing failing on me, or when is it working, or when is it slow, when is it fast? But if it's a constant string like that, it almost serves as like a unique ID for your query. And then you can figure out things like bottlenecks in your application or errors or things like that. So having a static, unchanged string and using variables to actually manipulate it has a lot of upsides. More variables. So you can pass lots of variables. In this case, this is an example of paginating data. So I'll widen this here. So we can define many variables, and we can define how to use them. So we can say we want the first X amount of items or the last X amount. We could either ask for items before or after a certain point, and then we can filter items. These arguments are going to be dependent on what GraphQL API is exposing. Not every API is going to have these arguments, but it's fairly common, like to have arguments like this. So we could say first one, and in this case I can say after null. Oh, and this is telling me the arguments need to be valid JSON. I'm missing a comma. So it's tooling like this is super helpful. It makes you move really fast as a developer. So I can specify I want the first one. And in this case, I'm asking, this is some of that edge data, I'm not just getting a list of posts, I'm getting a list of posts with extra data, like page info. Like in this list of posts, is there another page of posts? Like in this case, I'm asking for one, it says, hey, there's another page, do you want it? I'm telling you there is another page, yes. And the end cursor, or the point in the database that we're at, is right here. So if I want to ask for the next item, I can take this end cursor. What is going on? I can take this end cursor and I can say, I want the first post after that one, right? So I could use that in my variable, and I'm going to get the next post, the first post after hello, or whatever I was at. And I can continue to paginate, right? Oh gosh. All right, so I can get the next post again. So this is forward pagination. Backward pagination would be just you would use last and before instead of first and after. But same thing, you would use these cursors or pointers to where in the data set you're at, and it would go forward or backward from there. And then if we do something like, I don't think I have that much data in this data set. So if I say I want 100 items, well, we don't have more data. So I'm going to return up to 100 items, and I'm going to tell you there's not another page, so you can stop paginating now, okay? So directives, directives is an interesting feature as well. So GraphQL has two built-in directives on any GraphQL server. There's include and skip. So, and they take one argument. So a directive looks like this. After the field, you put an @ sign and then the name of the directive, and then they can optionally have arguments themselves. So in this case, I'm going to use a variable called include field, and if that variable is true, this field is going to be included, right? So since it's true, I'm going to get this page info field and this link page info. If this variable is false, let's say I'm not logged in as a user, or I'm on the wrong page, or whatever, I have some property, or the application has some property that should determine this is false. Next time it executes, since it's false, it's not included, right? So I can specify at the query level some logic, like if this variable is true or false, include or skip this. So I can do the inverse here. I can say skip. I'm going to use the same variable though, so this is going to get trippy, right? When I execute this, I'm going to have link but not page info, and if I make it false or true, I'll get page info but not link. Right, so now we got page info but not link. So you can do some of this logic. A lot of times in applications, you're going to fetch all this data, and then you're probably going to determine whether you need it or not after you've already received it. So with GraphQL, you can determine, hey, if this state that I don't know how to predict ends up meeting or not meeting this criteria, don't get me this data, or do get me this data. So super powerful. Another awesome feature of any GraphQL server, if you register this type, it's called unions. So unions are for when you have a data set that you don't know the type of until runtime. A common use of this is like search, right? Like, I don't know, let's say you're searching and you might, like a real estate site, it might be of type house or condo or apartment, let's just say. You're not going to know until the search results come back whether it's a house or a condo or an apartment or whatever. So what this allows you to do is specify, like in this case, I can get a list of terms, and terms might be categories or tags or something else. And so I can specify if, when execution occurs, the type is a category, I want these fields. But if it's a tag, I want these fields. So when I execute this, we can specify, let's see if I can find an example. So here we go. Here we have one that's a tag, and it's only getting the 3 fields that I asked for tags, link, slug, and type name. But if it's a category, I ask for 4 fields. So if you're doing search, right, you might have a different component that renders categories and tags, and they can use their fragment, right? You could have a tag component that manages its fragment, right? And then you'd have a switch statement probably in your React app that says, if it's category, use this component and render this data. If it's tag, use this component. So we can specify without knowing ahead of time, we can specify what data we want. If you're looking to extend this, if you use WordPress and want to extend this, WordPress has a post type registry API where you can register post types or content types. So in this case, I'm going to register type book. And I'm going to give it a label like books. That's what's going to show up in my admin when I interact with it. I can specify fields I want to support in admin. And then here I'm going to say show in GraphQL. So I can say, yes, I want this content to be available to the GraphQL API. In GraphQL, I want it to be referred to as book and books, so a single and a plural name. And then taxonomy. This allows us to group books, right? So we can group books into genres. So I'm registering a taxonomy called genre. And again, I'm showing in GraphQL, give it single and plural name, genre, and genres. And then here I can specify like whether I want it to be a hierarchical terms or not, like whether they can have children or not. What is happening? There we go. And then if I want to filter the core GraphQL schema, like add a price field, that's not native to WordPress, right? But I can add it. So I can filter the GraphQL book fields, add a price, and then I can write a function that returns data however I want. So this resolve function, this is a little dated, but close enough. This resolve function is going to get an instance of the post because we're filtering the book fields, books or posts. So we're going to get the post, and then I can say, given this post, how do I want to resolve this field? Well, I want to get post meta. That's how WordPress stores metadata. So I can fetch the meta, the price meta of that post. So what this looks like now, I've registered books to the schema. I've registered genres. We can see there's no red squigglies, so this is a valid query. I can ask for books, and on the books, I can ask for genres and price. And when I execute a query like this, I can get a list of books. I can get their genres. I talked about this at WordCamp Phoenix, so you can see WordCamp Phoenix up here. You can see the price, $9.99, right? And of course, using GraphQL with WordPress, and you can see it's priceless, right? So, you know, yeah. So this is not a complete example, but you can see this rendered very similar to the other example here. So we can very easily register custom fields and types to the GraphQL schema in WordPress and start interacting with whatever data you're managing in WordPress. All right, so this is one thing I love to show. If we were going to build this slice of UI, I want to show how we could do it in different ways. So first, let's say we're going to talk with, we're going to go to some planning meeting and say, here, we need to build this thing. So we need a list of posts, and on that post, we need an author. We need the author's name. We need the author's avatar at a certain size and the URL to render it. We need the site that author writes for, and the name and the link. We need the follow link so we can click this and follow that author. We need the title. We need the featured image for that article that they wrote, and we need the URL so we can render it. And then we need the excerpt of the article. So here's our requirements, right? Let's go build this. So if we were in normal WordPress with PHP, we'd end up having to write something like this. We'd say, hey, I need a list of posts. I need 4 posts that are published, right? So that gets me enough info to render a list. Then I have to do things like go get the author data and get the author's avatar. So I'm going to iterate over that list of 4 posts and then say, for each post, give me the author's avatar. And then for each post, let's pretend these sites are custom terms. So I'm going to say, get me the site terms, pluck the first one out, render it. Give me this custom follow link that, is just something custom you're doing in WordPress. Give me the title of the post. So we're saying for each post, give me the title. For each post, give me the image thumbnail URL. Get me the excerpt. So we're writing all this code to render this slice of UI. If we're using the WordPress REST API, it's going to look something like this. So we make our first request to the post endpoint. We say, hey, I want 4 posts. Okay, it gave us a fairly large payload, 12 seconds worth of payload or whatever it was. So I have enough data to render this much of the UI, but I don't have it all, so I have to go back. So now for each post, I have to say, hey, I need the author for each post. So I need the post 1 author, post 2 author, post 3 author, but I also need the avatar, which is at another endpoint. So I need to get the post, avatar for author 1, avatar for author 2. Then I got to go back and get the sites for author 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I got to get the featured image for the 2 that gave me an ID. So I got to do all these round trips. So we just made like 47,000 HTTP requests to render that slice of UI. GraphQL, I could say, hey, I want to make a query for 4 posts. I want the author, the name, and the avatar at a specific size so we don't render way too big. I also need the site name and link. I need the follow link. I need the title and the featured image also at a specific size, and the excerpt. So I can write this GraphQL query, and it looks almost like our plain English list of requirements that you worked with whoever, your designer or manager or whoever it might be, product owner. And yeah, so that's what it looked like the experience of GraphQL looks like. I want to come back to this. I showed you how slow the Denver Post REST API was. I want to show you how fast the same Denver Post GraphQL API is. So the same database behind the scenes, same business logic, same everything. I'm also going to ask for 100 posts. Whoop. Oh gosh, what do I? Oh, hold on. Let me copy that. Oh gosh, I do not know how to do this standing up. I got to open up network tools for you. All right, ready? Okay, so, right, okay. So we had 12, did I leave this open? Yeah, I did. Cool. 14.8 seconds per 100 posts with REST. 2.32 seconds could probably be faster still, but 6.1 kilobytes of data versus 419 kilobytes of data. A big reason for that, because I'm only specifying the exact fields that I need, right? So with the REST API, if all I need is the ID, the title, and the date, well, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get everything with GraphQL, and it's going to execute all the functions on the server to get that to you. Here, if all we're building is a list of ID, title, and date, right, like you'll see on the homepage of any newspaper or whatever, we can specify that, and then it's not going to run the functions to do things like render the content for you or filter various fields that happen on the WordPress server. So it's going to execute as minimal functions as possible to get this data to you, and the payload of the actual download time is going to be saved because it's how many hundreds of times less? 419. So it's almost what, 80 times less or something? 419 kilobytes, 6.1 kilobytes. Do the math. 80 something. I don't know. It's my guess. Quite a bit less data that you're transferring. So I'll just do. This won't play audio on my computer. All right, whatever. I'll just narrate. So another way GraphQL actually makes it more efficient than many other ways of interacting with data. There's a concept called data loader that many GraphQL servers make use of. And a lot of programs will do this thing called, we'll say, for each item, get me this related thing. So in my case, we were for each post, get me the author, which is going to say, I have 4 posts. I'm going to get the author for post 1, get the author for post 2, get the author for post 3. So this guy's example, he's querying for books. On those books, he's going to query for reviews and user. So the first query is going to say, give me everything for books. I'm going to get 10 books in response. For each book, give me the reviews. There's 4 reviews per book. So that was 10 queries to get reviews for book 1, reviews for book 2, reviews for book 3. And then for all 4D reviews that we have, give me the user, which is now 40 more queries because we're going to say for each review. So we end up with 51 total queries. And typical programming is something we're all probably maybe guilty of at some point, is saying, like, for each thing, go get me something else. So how to avoid this and how GraphQL enables us to, since we know what data we want ahead of time, right? We write a query saying, here's what I want. We can select, same way he was doing before, we're going to select the 10 books, but instead of returning them right away, we're going to store their IDs in a temporary cache, and then we're going to come back and say, yep, so we're going to say, give me the review for any of these 10 books. So instead of give me reviews for book 1, book 2, book 3, we're going to say, give me all reviews for book 1 through 10. And so then we can do that again for the review, or the users of the reviews, or the author of the reviews. So instead of, what was it, 51 total queries, it'd be 3 total queries. And as your application scales, if you ask for 100 items, the other way is going to be exponentially greater. You're going to have, what, 401 queries, where with GraphQL, you're still going to have 3 queries to your underlying database. So GraphQL makes like the database connections a lot faster. Yeah, that's kind of the gist of how it does it. So WPGraphQL is still in a pre 1.0. So I've got a link here to our roadmap project if anybody's interested in following along. Some of the things we're working on to get to that 1.0. I've learned a lot about GraphQL in the time that I've maintained this, so I've got a lot of breaking changes I want to make it the best API I can. So we want to break those changes now before 1.0. Some of those features include nesting one-to-one connections. I talked about this edge data. We have a lot of spots in the GraphQL schema where we don't provide that edge data, and it's pretty important. So we're going to go back and refactor some of those fields to support edge data. Feature I actually opened a pull request for today, revision and preview support. Pretty big deal in WordPress. As you modify your content, it stores revisions. A lot of people like to look at those revisions, like what the next state of the site is before they click publish, or what it used to look like in case you need to revert. I had a version of revision support previously, and it was, if you're interested in learning more, I can talk to you about why it's better now. Working on a lot of stuff with interfaces. I didn't get into interfaces. Interfaces are similar to the unions that I showed, where you can specify different fields based on different type. Yeah, I don't have a good demo for it, but basically you can register an interface that has common fields, and then register types in your GraphQL API that have those same fields, but maybe have slightly different fields as well. Like, let's say you could have a person interface, and you could have a user that implements that, because all persons have a first name and a last name, for example, but users might have a login, where not every person has a login. And you might have authors that have different properties, but maybe not a login, but they have a first and last name, right? So you have these different types in your schema that implement an interface of common fields. And then, yeah, we're introducing a content connection, which allows, right now we have entry points for like posts, pages, houses, cars, whatever you can think of. We're introducing a connection that will allow you to query for any type of content from the root, and then using a union, you can specify on post or on page, giving these fields. And then Gatsby, my employer is paying for a security audit before we get to 1.0. Credit Karma uses the plugin in production. They paid for a security audit back in February, and we got all that stuff patched up. But before we go to 1.0, we're going to do another one. So Gatsby source WPGraphQL. So I work at Gatsby. I'm going to talk a little bit about Gatsby. So Gatsby, who's heard of Gatsby? I can remember. Some people heard of it. All right. So Gatsby is a React-based framework for building blazing fast apps and sites. So it's React-based. It's most commonly used for building static sites. So what that means is it has a build step where you wire up your Gatsby site to fetch data from somewhere. It can really be almost anything you can think of. It could come from WordPress. It could come from Airtable. It could come from Contentful or Google Sheets. For all, like any source of data can work with Gatsby pretty much. Gatsby goes and fetches data from whatever source you tell it to, puts that data into React components, which then turn into static HTML files. And then when the end user is interacting with the Gatsby site, instead of, like in WordPress, end user makes a request to page, it talks to PHP server, PHP does a lookup to SQL, gets all the data it needs, compiles an entire HTML page, serves it back to the user. That's pretty common for most websites today. Gatsby does that data collection ahead of time, builds a static template. So when you talk to a Gatsby site, you're just saying, hey, give me this page, and it returns it right away. There's no database interaction happening right then. So instead of, 2 or 3 seconds to average, give or take, WordPress site without good cache, Gatsby is like milliseconds response. So some things we're doing with Gatsby. So I joined Gatsby back in June, and then we hired a guy, Tyler Barnes, who joined 6 weeks ago or so to work with me. So basically what we want to do at Gatsby, if you're using WordPress with Gatsby, we want to enable you to do the same things you do with WordPress today, but better. So we're working on a couple plugins that you can plug into Gatsby on the Gatsby side that will talk to WordPress over WPGraphQL. So WordPress, or Gatsby, has a current source plugin that allows you to source data from WordPress using the WordPress REST API. We're deprecating support for that, and then you're gonna have to use WPGraphQL. We're gonna introduce some common concepts that if you do use WordPress, you might be familiar with. Things like template hierarchy and routing. What I mean by template hierarchy, in WordPress, we have the concept of building like template parts, and you can override those in child themes, basically. So Gatsby has a similar concept called component shadowing, but we're going to give similar paradigms that WordPress has to Gatsby users using WordPress. Routing, what I mean by routing is when you publish a post in WordPress, it shows up, let's say, on an archive page for posts, a list of all posts. It also shows up on things like search pages. It also shows up on an individual URL for that post. Gatsby, by default, you kind of have to go through the hoops of wiring up that stuff on your own. So we're going to abstract that for you and say if you publish content in WordPress, it's going to have a predictable place in your Gatsby site too, without you having to figure out how to do that. We're going to have search support. Depending on how your WordPress setup, if you leave your WordPress site live that Gatsby can have live connection to, it'll use API to actually do search results. Some people will use WordPress as a CMS and then shut down the WordPress instance and just leave the Gatsby site up. Search won't work in that case. Preview, we're going to have live preview support. So I mentioned I did pull requests today for revisions. This is going to play into that. So you can actually see visually how your data is changing over time. We're doing some awesome stuff with fast rebuilds. So Gatsby, like I said, has this rebuild step where it goes and gets data from your source. We're doing some advanced caching so that we can fetch as little data as possible on subsequent builds. So if you only change like the title of the post to correct a title, a typo, we're not going to fetch your entire site again. We're just going to fetch things that changed, right? We're doing live data updates. So this would be on your actual built site. Common complaint with Gatsby right now is like, oh, if I publish my site, publish a change, it's got to rebuild the site. It takes 3 or 4 minutes or whatever. So with Gatsby Cloud, it's basically a stateful build system. So it knows what's been built before, knows what data is changing, and can just rebuild parts of your site. So you can get the benefits of a static site and benefits of your data being live instantly, like you're used to in something like WordPress. So I don't have any demos of Gatsby, but just want to give kind of an idea of where we're headed with stuff. If you're interested in contributing, I have links to that here too. I'll tweet these slides out. You can follow me at Jason Bahl on Twitter and at WPGraphQL. That's all I got. So open for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Earlier in your presentation, you queried users and posts, and then the authors on the post.
Yeah.
And then I think you mentioned that it was caching the users that it already got.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to request those again. Is that caching sort of just contained to that query, or is it going to persist afterwards?
So one thing to note, so some details like that, GraphQL by itself, where can I look at that slide? Hold on. Somewhere in here. Oh, no, it passed. There we go. So one thing to note about GraphQL, by itself is just like a way to declare what your schema looks like and gives you tools to write how to resolve that schema. Things like caching, you still have to implement. There are tools like I mentioned, Data Loader is a tool that you can use with GraphQL But GraphQL itself doesn't do that. You still have to wire it up to figure out how to do that. So that's like where I come in. I wired it up to WordPress. You'll have to wire it up to your Flask app, you said, right? So caching data loader is a library. It's only like 100 and something lines of code, but it does the batching and caching for you. So you have to write loaders, and basically they're just functions that say, given a list of keys or IDs, here, how do I get that data? So it could be a SQL query, it could be a MongoDB query, it could be a fetch to another REST API or whatever. And then data loader will cache that. So once, let's say, if you ask anywhere in your GraphQL query for user ID 1, and then you ask for user ID 1 again in the same request, then it will return from the cache instead of making another request.
In that context.
Yeah, you can, and then caching across, like in WordPress, there's drop-in cache plugins like Redis or Memcache or whatever that will be persistent object caches. So, but that's going to be up to your other application architecture. But then, so like in our case, in WordPress case, it's going to say, hey, I want these objects. And in most WordPress sites, there's persistent object cache. So it would probably first check for something like Redis or whatever to see, does it exist here? If it doesn't, then I'll talk to SQL. If it does, I'm just going to pull it from the cache, and that'd be persistent across requests. But that's outside of GraphQL.
So this is pretty cool stuff. It's a pretty novel way to use GraphQL. But did you run up against any limitations of the specification when you were the GraphQL specification when you were implementing this? Were there any missing features or anything jump to mind?
So maybe. So I don't know if they're missing or, yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so GraphQL ships with different types. So you can declare, like, a field could be a string or an integer or a Boolean or another object type. It doesn't have like a date time scalar field. So that's one that's like, basically you're presenting dates as strings most of the time. Or, yes, you could do an integer like since 1970, whatever they call it, whatever. So some of that, like, it would be nice if that was standardized. They are,
types.
Yeah, some of that, they are discussing potentially bringing a date time officially.
Yeah, it seems like a big one.
That one, most of the things you might, in my case at least, you think are like a frustration at first, and then you're like, oh, I get why now. Like, it's a constraint. And then you're like, if I can work within this, I'm actually going to build better applications. So one thing, so GraphQL itself doesn't prescribe the shape. I mentioned that earlier. You can literally have a GraphQL API that is one field called hello and returns world. And that could be your entire API, right? It doesn't, GraphQL doesn't care what your API looks like. And then at first that's a good thing, but if you don't really study API design, it can hurt you really fast. Like, if you look at version 1 of my plugin, you could query list posts, and it was just that, a list of posts. So you would say posts, ID, title, date. And then I was like, oh, how do I paginate this? Well, I can't, because I'm getting a list of posts, but I need to know, like, are there more posts? So, like, I learned that lesson, like, super quick. I was like, so I kind of came up with my own way. So it changed from posts to posts, and then a field called items, and then it was a list of items there, and then I had, like, some page fields there. And then a couple months later, I found relay spec, and I was like, this edges and nodes thing looks wild. I don't understand it. GitHub actually has a public GraphQL API. I think that was the first time I came across it. I was like, what is this edges and nodes? It doesn't make sense. But then I started studying it and was like, oh, this solves a lot of problems, like pagination and consistent arguments, like first, last, after, before for pagination, forward or backward. I can paginate posts, plugins, themes, categories, like anything with the same terminology now. Like in WordPress, if you're familiar with WordPress, paginating users, paginating posts, and paginating terms all have different terminology. You have post for page and then page number, or you have number and offset and then skip and limit, like or something like that. It's like 3 different terminologies for 3 different data sets. Now with GraphQL, it's first and last, after and before for all the data sets. So like, how it's implemented behind the scenes doesn't matter anymore. Hopefully, did I answer your question? I don't know. I ramble a lot, sorry. Cool, man. Sweet. Happy to,
One
yeah.
question. The instant rebuilds you had for Gatsby, you said that's upcoming. That's not currently.
Yeah, I mean, we have incremental builds in, what is it? What's the state? Beta? Is it closed beta? Open beta? Huh? Oh, yeah. It's in, okay, yeah. So it's kind of available. Go sign up for Gatsby Cloud and check it out.
Then move Gatsby away from just static sites into more standard apps that you can build with.
Yeah.
Is that the goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. It's Gatsby's React, right? And what do you build with React? Applications, right? So, yeah, that's kind of the goal. You can build applications even without the incremental builds. That'll make your static stuff better. But you can already today, since it's React, you can already do dynamic stuff with Gatsby pretty easily, or well, depending on your experience with React, I guess. But yeah. And it's always going to get better. Like, we're doing some stuff specifically on the WordPress side. So if you use WordPress with Gatsby, it's going to be like much less resources needed on the WordPress side to make it fast, things like that. Like, we'll have some caching on the WordPress side specifically and the Gatsby side. So like, as you're making changes, like as little data as possible is going to go back and forth between the two systems. So. Sweet.